That doesn't begin to express what Barbara Olson was and what she had accomplished. She was on the flight, apparently, that crashed into the Pentagon. She got out her cell phone, surely at great risk to herself, and called someone and said, we're being hijacked and this is not a joke. Barbara Olson is the wife of the Solicitor General of the United States, Ted Olson. She's a very well-known former federal prosecutor. She was quite outspokenly critical of Bill Clinton in the Lewinsky matter. And what we are starting to see is that there are individual people that are a part of this carnage, and we're just starting to see the definition of the tragedy that's here.
That's right, Fred. For so many people, it's just been another news story until it all hit home.
Yeah.
Today, you and I, both friends with Barbara Olson, both on the airways and in real life.
Yeah.
Fred, the toll, the gurneys being taken out of the trade centers, the beds lined up outside the hospitals, especially St. Vincent's Hospital, as we speak. Over the city of New York, we are being protected by government Air Force fighter planes, and as we speak, fighter ships are converging along the eastern seaboard. Fred, it almost seems completely unreal until the mention of the name of Barbara Olson has hit home with all of us.
Well, it's we're going to hear more of those names. There will be more people who we knew about, and who we will mourn. I now want to go to our security expert who is in Philadelphia, Arthur Allen Woke. And will you tell us, in your judgment, how was it that these 4 separate teams of hijackers could have gone, in some cases, to different airports, or at least to different, obviously different departure points at the same airport, perhaps, and know that they were going to be able to pull it off without being discovered?
I think we all have to realize that if someone is willing to lose their life in order to carry out a plan such as this, that there's really no security system in place at any airport in the world that could prevent them from at least one or more of the teams from succeeding in their effort.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the part that came before, when they somehow smuggled weapons, I assume, through the security system. They got on board and they were able to hijack 4 airplanes, and it all worked. There may have been a shooting on the one that crashed near Pittsburgh. But otherwise, it was a pretty slick operation. How could they know? Is this an inside job?
Well, it certainly can be an inside job, but I will tell you that our security system that currently exists is a joke. It is a system that's designed to detect metal weapons that for a very long period of time have been abandoned by virtually anyone who's been involved in terrorism. Composite, that is to say plastic weapons, are the weapons of choice today, and those cannot be seen either by the X-ray machines or by the metal detectors that we all use. And everyone knows that this is a system that is basically something to give people a sense of security, but in reality provides very little real security.
Well, Arthur, welcome again. Thanks for staying on with myself and Fred. Nancy Grace here. Arthur, even if it were not a plastic device, if a gun was broken down, for instance, into various parts, would those metal detectors, would those scanner machines be able to pick them up as they travel through?
Well, if you've ever looked at the scanning machines and the people who are looking at what they're scanning, you'll notice that half the time you look in there, between the hair dryers and the other accoutrements that people bring with them, oftentimes it's almost impossible to tell what's being carried there. So if it doesn't look like an assembled gun, it's sometimes very difficult for a person to say that, well, there's something being smuggled aboard. I agree with you, Nancy, that if they were broken down, or if there was, for example, lead foil placed around any of the components that might be identifiable, those scanning machines would be worthless. And that's the point I'm really trying to make. We've known for many, many years that this is a system that is not designed to really find the criminal among us. It's rather, it's someone who is basically making a mistake in bringing an arm aboard an aircraft. In other words, someone who is not sophisticated will be found, but a terrorist, especially those who carried this off today, were far more sophisticated than that.
Arthur, stay right there. Now joining us also former FBI Bob Ricks. Hi, Bob. Thanks for being with Fred and with me.
Well, glad to be here. I wish it were under different circumstances.
I certainly agree. As a former FBI, could you give us your insight as it stands right now?
Well, I was the special agent in charge of the FBI in Oklahoma City when we had the bombing in 1995. And in all honesty, the meetings I've had with the governor and National Guard and other community leaders, it brings back a lot of memories and what we went through during that time period. But in some ways, our experience is going to pale in comparison to the enormity of the tragedy that's existing here today. We've never seen anything like this on our shores. We never experienced anything like this even during wartime. What we're going through right now is you have a number of different functions taking place. You have, first off, the rescue effort, which is paramount, to try to find those that are injured and yet can have the chance to survive. At the same time, you have a crime scene investigation going forward. Those two will work independently, but at the same time, very much in a compatible nature to ensure that one does not interfere with the other. And that's what we did in Oklahoma City. It's going to be widespread. The resources of the FBI will be utilized throughout the world. There's obviously a security lapse.
Bob,
yes.
They said that that was the report after the USS Cole bombing, that we would scour the world until the scoundrels were brought to justice. And as we see overseas, very, very little cooperation with that effort on behalf of the United States.
Well, I think that's probably going to be true here as well. You have two different things going on: the FBI and its resources around the world. And there will be cooperation, believe me, even though it will not be public. We'll be doing its end, but this is also an act of war. There's no way of getting around that. In some cases, we may learn that this was an organization that has previously carried out acts of war against this country. It has a lot of the earmarkings of Osama bin Laden. If that's the case, there are other resources available to retaliate in this circumstance. The domestic resources are available. Those that are left, we will certainly bring them back and try them and ensure that justice is done.
I'd like to follow up just for a moment on something that Arthur Allen Woke mentioned just a moment ago, and perhaps you'll have a comment on that too, Mr. Riggs. Mr. Woke, you were talking about the fact that currently the way the metal detection systems are set up in these airports and their X-ray machines, that these composite handguns can pass right through them. What do you think we're going to have to do in this country to fully protect ourselves? And is it going to mean that you have to go to the airport 2 hours before your flight leaves so they can put you through your paces?
You may remember that this whole system went in place when there was hijackings that occurred in this country. We didn't have a security system at airports before that time. So perhaps there may be a more detailed security check, but I don't think that's the answer. And with all due respect to my colleague, and I do have great respect for him, I do want to say to you that somebody was asleep at the switch today and a long time before today in our government. This was a very sophisticated operation. This was carried out over a long period of time. Now, we're supposed to have security agencies both overseas and that act overseas from this country, and many security agencies in this country, all of whom failed to predict, to find, to intercept, to stop, to prevent this from occurring.
Well, you're absolutely correct, especially in light of the Pentagon tragedy. We all assume that the airspace over state federal buildings in D.C. is protected. Not so.
But Nancy, it's meaningless. You can't protect airspace. There's not like a gate there that you can open up and say, okay, this airplane comes in.
Clearly you cannot
Well, that's right.
it.
So the point I'm trying to make is, if you think any security system at an airport is going to prevent an event like this, that's a sad mistake. These events are prevented before the terrorists get in this country, or if they are successful in getting in this country, before they're able to successfully carry out their mission. For example, where was the security at Boston? Where was the security that kept these people from getting on the airplane? You know, we don't have sky marshals anymore on these airplanes that perhaps in some events can prevent these acts from occurring. Where were our allies providing us with information? This is not something that comes up. This wasn't planned this morning. This was planned for months and months and months.
You know, we were discussing the possibility of tighter restrictions here in the United States, but in other countries, specifically in Israel and other countries as well, that is commonplace. It is only here in America and a few other countries that don't have those security precautions.
Well, we have to maintain our free society. It's really what we're all about. And terrorism would be successful if it changed the way we do things in this country. But there is something that we must change as a people. We must change the way government responds to us and to our needs. The focus of government has to be to prevent this from happening. And I think our inquiry, after we bury our dead and we heal our injured, has to be what happened, why did it happen, how can we prevent it, and who should be accountable. And I mean accountable in the sense of who was asleep at the switch that allowed this pervasive act of terrorism to happen today.
Mr. Riggs, do you think someone was asleep at the switch?
Well, I think there definitely was a lapse of intelligence, and I think we need to explore why did that occur. You need to look at, you know, lately the FBI has blundered. There's no doubt about that, and the FBI has been under attack. Has that attack, in fact, affected their capabilities? Right now, my understanding is the FBI has a total hiring freeze. They're going through a 5% cut with regard to its resources. I think morale is probably very low in the FBI. Now, does that give you justification not for doing your job? Absolutely not. But I'm not sure after years and years of attack on conducting intelligence investigations that we have a vigorous intelligence system that's really in existence any longer.
We have another guest who is waiting to talk to us on the telephone. His name is Jim Burnett. I haven't been told exactly what why don't you just identify yourself and tell us what the message you have for us here, Mr. Burnett.
Well, I'm the former chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board. I did not call with that I had any particular message, except that I was asked if I would respond to participate in an interview.
Well, in that, thank you very much. I didn't have an opportunity to be briefed on this beforehand. What is your sense of what happened here, and do you agree with what we've just heard, is that someone was asleep at the switch?
Well, I don't know whether I want to adopt that right now. Obviously, there was a breach in our aviation security system, and it, you know, until we learn if there was a common thread to these four, the method of entry that was used by these four teams of hijackers, we probably need to keep the system down until we can at least spot the breach that they've already identified. It may be that certainly that they have other means of breaching the system. This seems to be a very sophisticated operation.
Let me ask you something, Mr. Burnett. With your expertise with the National Transportation Safety Board, how could this clearly choreographed act of war take place out of separate airports?
Well, again, I think it indicates a level of sophistication about our system, about the strength of the security in our system. It also reflects the ability to operate aircraft in our system to a certain extent. Now,
well, what happens when a pilot
with the Pittsburgh aircraft?
Jim, what happens when a pilot? What is a pilot supposed to do when they realize they are under hijack alert? What do they do?
Well, you have to realize that most of the training for flight crews in the United States has been to be very accommodating to hijackers in order to give a chance for negotiation to take place. It's not been a highly confrontational situation, and it's not been geared toward people who had the intention of flying a plane into a building, or even the capability of doing that. So what we have been prepared for through our previous events is something quite different from what we've experienced today.
Mr. Burnett, how drastically, if at all, do you think this country is going to have to modify and upgrade the security restrictions and procedures at the airports? I mean, are you going to have a 2-hour wait, get to the airport 2 hours before your flight because of the procedures you'll be put through?
Well, at least for some weeks and perhaps some months, that may in fact be what we have to do. We also may have to have very severe restrictions on carry-on baggage, for instance, so that that each piece of luggage can be thoroughly searched, and which would mean that most of us probably wouldn't be able to carry on something, and they might allow the mothers of babies to carry on a diaper bag or something of that nature. It's also possible that we may have to have restrictions on our checked luggage so that it can be thoroughly searched. We may in fact have to go on what is very close to a wartime footing. And I hope that one of the things that ought to come out of this is that we ought to be able to have the kind of national unity that we had following the tragedy on December the 7th of 1941, and do whatever our national leadership thinks is necessary, not only offensively but defensively, to get us to a solution of this problem.
Now, do you foresee personal searches, personal frisking of everyone who takes an airplane?
Well, again, I think that before I would call for that, I think we need to if we can, in short order, determine how these terrorists managed to do this and respond at least to that, perhaps even more broadly, even though we may have to take some measures that they did not use in this particular incident, because we would anticipate that they would the next time they try.
Well, we know already, of course, we don't have the whole story, Jim Burnett. We do know, however, that security protocols were violated at 3 major airports: Boston, Washington, and Newark. So we also know that these planes were hijacked.
Yeah, I don't know the techniques they used, and I think that's what's important for us to know.
Exactly, and that's what I wanted to ask you.
We don't know the techniques that were used.
That's what I wanted to ask you, what the actual protocol is. You earlier said that training thus far is for the airplane crew to remain friendly, if possible, with the hijacker to save lives. What are they supposed to do? Radio in? This had progressed so far by the time anyone realized a hijack situation was in place.
Well, again, we do not know yet exactly what happened after these planes were hijacked. I think that we may learn that, in fact, there were officials that knew that they had been hijacked and were expecting them to be diverted to the New York airport, which has not been an unusual situation in hijacking scenarios. What no one probably expected was that the plane was actually going to be used en route from Boston to New York for the purposes that it was used for.
Nancy?
Yes, go ahead.
Can I tell you that it's, and I agree with Jim, I've known him for a long time, as an airline transport pilot myself, I will tell you that we are trained to use one of the electronic instruments in the airplane to signal to air traffic controllers that we've been hijacked.
The hijack button.
Well, it's actually a squawk code. It's actually a code. The problem, of course, with that is we assume that the same crew that flew the aircraft is the crew that was flying the aircraft. That is to say that they were not disabled or killed by the hijackers.
Well, actually, earlier, an aviation expert had the theory that it was not the same crew, that a commercial pilot would never have flown directly without making any attempt to divert into the trade center.
I completely agree.
So there's speculation that the pilot was removed.
There's no question.
Even under duress, I don't think any pilot would have flown the plane into the side of a building. There's no reason to do that, no percentage in it, to put it colloquially. However, I think this whole situation suggests that, in fact, there were people who had some ability to control and manipulate these aircraft that were involved. Now, they may have failed in that in connection with the one that went down in the vicinity of Pittsburgh.
Correct.
I'd like to ask Bob Briggs here. Bob, there were a series of warnings from the FBI and from other governmental agencies over the past 3 months to Americans to avoid certain embassies and federal U.S. facilities overseas. And after a series of those, and really they seem to escalate, you could see something coming on, and now this. Is it possible that whoever did this faked the FBI out, made them think they were going overseas while they were concentrating here?
I really don't think so. I don't think they operate that way anyway. Their intentions are not to cause an alert one place and then divert their actions elsewhere. You're talking about a very complex situation where if it is a small terrorist group and is not a state-sponsored act, and we can't rule that out. There's still some countries out there that would love to carry out an offense like this against us. We tend not to to focus on those. But assuming that it is a very small separatist or irredentist type group, they easily had the capability, which they did demonstrate, to train, to put together this operation without anyone picking it up. They must be very aware of trafficking, on how to communicate without being detected, and also completely trustworthy within their inner circles, that no informants leak this information, which is extremely unusual for an operation this size.
Well, not only that, take into account that coming from 3 different locations, Boston, Washington, and Newark, the timing of it all took place nearly at the same time. One flight leaving at 7:58, one flight leaving at 8:02. The timing was incredibly coincidental.
Well, which means that they planned this well in advance. It would not surprise me that it wasn't just a sneaking through the metal detectors, but you may find other things in place, such as baggage handlers, such as what happened in Pan Am 103, where they used inside people working at various airports. I have no information that that's what has occurred, but you're talking about a very highly sophisticated operation at multiple areas taking place simultaneously. This had to be planned for months before this thing could have been carried out with such precision.
Are you surprised at all if indeed you had 4 planes that were hijacked, and let's say the plan was that they would kill the pilots and that one of the hijackers would fly right straight into whatever the target was? Are you surprised at all that a group could put together 4 people capable of flying a sophisticated airplane, and then all of them with enough zealotry in them that they're willing to sacrifice their lives?
Supposedly, Osama bin Laden has had that capability of using pilots and has trained pilots for suicide missions. Again, is it his responsibility? We will know, I think, fairly shortly. But there are groups out there that are willing to give their life for their cause. This is the way they get to heaven.
Well, what do you make of the denials from both the camp of Osama bin Laden and the Hamas that they had anything to do with this?
This is typical in all these situations. You're going to have numerous people take credit.
Well, so far it's been all denials.
I understand. I'm saying you're going to have numerous people and groups that are going to take credit. And the way it always works is the official representatives always give denials. But there will be, through what is transmitted, an understanding, at least in the community, as to who has responsibility.
Question back to Bob Ricks, former FBI. Fred brought up the excellent point that not only do you have to have aircraft pilots in on this, 4 of them, that are willing to lose their own lives, totally dedicated to a cause. And plus, you have to have the intricate knowledge of the airplane and airport workings to pull this off. That certainly limits the identity, does it not?
It limits the number of people who are capable of doing such a thing, and it also points to the complexity of the operation. That's why I believe that it's taken months, if not longer, to carry out this particular operation. I don't think it was something that was put together last week to coincide with some date that's taking place today. I've heard that this might have been the date of the signing of the Camp David Accords. There's a sentencing hearing tomorrow on one of the associates of Osama bin Laden. Some of this has been known for some time, but this probably took over a year, I would estimate, to put together an operation of this nature.
What about it, Arthur?
Well, I certainly don't disagree that this is an operation so sophisticated that it would have taken an extensive period of time to put together. I'm not at all surprised that one could assemble pilots capable of flying these aircraft into it. What stuns me, actually, is that they chose airplanes that would have been full of fuel, because they were both scheduled to go coast to coast. And then I'm sure that was part of the plan, because I believe that the secondary explosions that we saw that brought the buildings down were probably related to a misting of that fuel as it literally drenched floor to floor in the buildings and finally got ignited as it mixed with the air. So I agree this was very sophisticated. I agree that it probably took a long time. And I must point out once again that you're not going to stop something like this at the gate, and you're not going to stop it getting on to an airplane. It's got to be stopped overseas or before you let people get into the country. And that's why the security agencies of this country need to be re-examined quickly and carefully.
Arthur Woke, thank you very much for your insights here. It's been fascinating. I also want to thank Jim Burnett for joining with us here. It's been very instructive, Mr. Burnett. Thank you both. Bob Riggs is going to stay on with us for a little while, and that leads me to a question that I just wondered. How is it that the FBI is going to penetrate? The implication of what Mr. Woke said is that you get over there and you infiltrate these groups in Afghanistan or wherever they happen to be. How can the FBI possibly, these are small, tightly knit groups, penetrate those groups and nip it in the bud before it happens?
Well, the FBI is not going to do that overseas. The FBI has to rely on other either foreign intelligence services or CIA or other types of organizations such as that. The FBI has no authority to conduct such operations overseas.
Well, American intelligence or counterintelligence agency.
That is correct. They have that obligation to follow those types of things. Extremely difficult to nip those in the bud. I used to be part of, when I was in D.C., part of a coordinating subgroup that met with the National Security Council on a weekly basis, where we would review terrorist groups around the world. And in all honesty, you have every terrorist group around the world has a presence in New York City, almost without exception. They have an infrastructure that already exists. They historically were the golden goose that laid the egg to finance their operations around the world, as well as the Soviet Union and other state sponsors. But a tremendous amount of money was funneled from the United States, particularly New York and other areas, Detroit, Los Angeles, to these groups to support them. So they are spread out throughout the world. It is a complex procedure, plus there are very many restrictions with regard to monitoring these groups once they become citizens in the United States.
Well, Bob, so much finger-pointing today at this hour toward Osama bin Laden. We know he is capable. His staff has, if you could call them staff, the training, the base, the money, the dogma to support this type of incident. Question to you, in the history of Osama bin Laden, however, we have not seen this particular type of terrorist attack.
Well, he's utilized bombings before,
correct,
particularly against embassies, and those were designed to have maximum impact. And plus, we knew that he was trying to carry out actions in the United States a little over a year ago, even though those were thwarted. And he's also been heard recently making pronouncements that it's time to take the war to the United States. So we know that he would love to carry out such an action. Whether that occurred or not, we really can't say. And it's also too early to judge. We have to be very careful on what we say. A lot of what was said early on in the Oklahoma City bombing turned out not to be correct.
That's right. Comparisons were made to overseas terrorist attacks, and yet it turned out to be an entirely
completely
different
domestic
nature.
Now, I will bet you $1 million to 1 that this is not a domestic attack. I don't think that that's taking place. But for the conspiracy theorists, a lot of the early statements that were made even by the media as they surmised what took place and took various statements out of context still linger today. And they give justification for why a so-called conspiracy exists and why Timothy McVeigh did not carry out the bombing because of early news reports. And that is your job, to put out as much information as possible. But in all honesty, no one knows at this point who carried this out.
Joining us right now, Paul Headland, aviation attorney. Hi, Paul. Paul, are you with me? Paul, are you with me?
Yes.
Paul, as an aviation attorney at this point, where do investigators go? We are still at this point trying to save people from the...
Imagine, given the fact that people had to get on these planes and, buy tickets.
Way too early to make any conclusions about that. It's just simply to note that speculation centers around Osama bin Laden, as it has in almost every other case of terrorism over the last 6 to 8 years. Although it's true that...
Free pizza! away from the World Trade Center, the streets were shut down. Therefore, more and more people were hearing by mouth and then gathering behind me in Times Square. In the conventional New York through history, the way to learn news, although this time about an attack on their own city and elsewhere. And we'll bring you in a moment, David, some of what they were telling us. But first, the full impact was seen in the moment in time. My colleague Stephen Evans, who was in the Trade Center and was interviewed just after the first explosion.
Than that, there was another big explosion in the other tower. Flames coming out in this billowing grey smoke. People still not panicking, people not quite understanding what was going on. Then somebody said that they saw an airliner go into one of those towers. Then, I don't know, an hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that. The thing that strikes me is, one, the terribleness of the incident, whatever the cause, and we don't go into politics, but whatever the cause, the terribleness, the hugeness of what's happened. So huge, in fact, that most of the people around simply can't understand what happened. People were just standing around, talking at each other, nodding their heads. Oh my God. We gotta go. Oh my God.
These pictures then of the immediate aftermath. David, behind me in Times Square, phalanxes of people all day, tourists and people headed north, remember, trying to get away, to get home, and at the moment they're stranded. They were speaking to us, giving their reaction on what had happened in their city.
I'm glad to be alive. I mean, there was a total stampede of people. I fell a couple of times, got, slightly trampled, but I walked away with just a scratched knee. So I'm just trying to get home right now to be with my family.
Were you working downtown? Is that what?
Yes, I work on Wall Street, 14 Wall Street, and the devastation is unbelievable. And I'm quite sure that the loss of life is enormous.
It's a very densely packed area down there. Were you with people you knew? Did you lose people at the moment you can't find?
Well, currently, right now, there is a friend of mine that worked in the second tower, and I tried to call her this morning when I heard about the first plane crashing into the building, and I have not been able to reach her.
We still don't know the magnitude of it, and it's just horrible.
Do you live and work in the city?
I work in the city.
What's your day been like?
Chaotic. Everyone fleeing from downtown, getting as far away from the chaos as possible, and not knowing what's going to happen next. Just horrible.
Where did you go first? Where were you when it happened?
I was in Midtown, and I walked towards Central Park with hundreds of other people, just going away from the chaos of Wall Street.
We're in shock. I mean, the enormity of it and the significance of it hasn't filtered through yet, I don't think. But everyone's walking along. I mean, I walked up from 25th Street up Broadway, and people are walking around in shock, literally.
Do you think it's going to be long for that to turn to anger among people?
No, I don't, actually. I think that reaction will happen pretty quickly.
This is like Pearl Harbor. This is like an act of war. And I think that whatever retribution they can, I'm eye for an eye, and all that, but something's got to be done. We can't live like this. This is the capital of the world. More business is done here between 60th Street and downtown Manhattan than any place else in the world. The whole world is responsible for this area here.
I checked on every single person I know. The co-worker I work with, she was very distressed. Her boyfriend she works on the 92nd floor, and she hasn't heard from him ever since. And we've been talking for like about 4 hours, trying to get in contact, and she hasn't seen him. She hasn't heard from him. So other than that, my family's good, but I don't know how she's going to do.
It's unbelievable. Got to work, I thought it was a normal, every other kind of day, and then everything changed. My life will never be the same, even though I had nobody, personally involved in what's happened today. I don't think things can ever go back to the way they were. So I'm...
Stephen Evans, we're hearing there people saying things will never be the same and talking about the sense of shock. How do you think things will change for New York?
It's very difficult to say. That thing happened, what is it, something like 7 hours ago, and it's still not real to me. It simply isn't real. People were wandering away, not being able to believe what had happened. You do change in strange ways. If you see people looking up into the sky, you suddenly get a frisson of fear. So that kind of fear is rippling through all those people who are there. And remember, 50,000 people work in those buildings. It was something like 9:15 in the morning. In the commercial capital of the world, you don't get times more busy than that. So I think an awful lot of people would have gone away from that thing and simply thought and ruminated about it. And that sort of shock takes time to come to you and then to get over it.
And is there any news about the number of dead, or indeed whether there are people injured and being taken out of the rubble of those towers that collapsed?
Not news that I've got. Obviously, you've just got to look at those pictures and realize that something very major has happened. One of the things that struck me was that people didn't move away immediately. People moved, if you like, I don't know, 100 meters away, but there were then explosions later. I noticed about an hour later, for example, in the street where I was, there were about 100 ambulances queuing up to get into the building. The emergency services were thick on the ground very, very quickly. But there was that second explosion and the collapse of the building. I'm not sure that the emergency services quite realized what was about to happen. There was a cloud of smoke. I don't quite know what the impact of that would have been.
And what was the...
You don't imagine that an airliner is going to crash into a building like that. Nobody quite knew what the engineering implications were. My suspicion is that there were casualties way after the initial impact.
And what was the mood actually in the street? We saw you as that building collapsed. Did people panic after that, or were they just aghast and standing watching?
It was genuinely very impressive. Clearly people were panicking, people were shocked, and you could see tears in their eyes and you could hear the shaking in their voices. But I didn't hear many people screaming, and I didn't hear anybody clambering to get over anybody else, if you like. I was evacuated from a hotel about 200 meters from the thing about an hour after the initial blast. There was a disabled lady trying to get downstairs. She was being very, very slow, and people were saying, hold on a minute, I'll help you down. So there was something uplifting, really, in the aftermath of all that.
Steve, thanks very much. We may have a chance to talk to you later about some of the other implications and the implications on the American economy, the world economy of what happened. But I'm joined now by Professor Galea, who's an expert in fire safety. And the specific thing I wanted to ask you about, because I know you've studied the time when the World Trade Center was bombed and the time it took to get people out. In terms of what happened today, would it have been possible to evacuate those buildings between the time that the aeroplane crashed into the tower and the time that the towers collapsed?
Well, going back to the experience of the '93 bombing, the first tower that actually took the brunt of the explosion, about 50% of the occupants of that building took between 1 to 3 hours to get out. Some people took considerably longer than that, aged people, disabled people, and so on. But about 50-odd% of the people required up to 3 hours to evacuate. Now, the building collapsed in a good deal less than 3 hours. So I would suspect that a lot of people would have been caught in the building.
It's such a huge building. When the airplane struck it, would people have realized what was happening, or would some people have been completely ignorant of what was going on until the building collapsed around them?
They're both extremely large buildings. They're 110 stories, a quarter of a mile high. A lot of the people in the building, in fact the majority of the people, wouldn't have realized what was going on. They would have felt a shudder, they would have heard the explosion, but they wouldn't really have realized what was going on. And so a lot of the people would not have reacted as you would expect them to get up and leave. A lot of people would have been wondering what was going on, getting onto the phone, looking out windows, trying to find out what was going on. Again, going back to the experience in the '93 incident, on average, it took 15 minutes for people before they actually decided that something was going on that they needed to evacuate.
And are you saying that even if people wanted to get out, and even if the escape had...
Come see what everybody's talking about. The Brass Armadillo Antique Mall off I-8035 between the 14th Street and 2nd Avenue exits. 36,000 square feet filled with the finest antiques, collectibles, and more. A veritable treasure hunt. And the Brass Armadillo Antique Mall is open 9 to 9 every day. You'll love the Brass Armadillo Antique Mall.
We got everybody talking about the brass armadillo.
Whether it's a new bike when you're a kid or a new home for your growing family, everyone likes something new. And now you have a new cable company, Mediacom, the fastest growing telecommunications company in America, dedicated to bringing the latest entertainment and information technology to communities just like yours. So even though we're new in town, it's already beginning to feel like home. Mediacom, your world now.
And then a United Airlines flight 175, which was bound from Boston to Los Angeles, carrying 56 passengers. That was the one that crashed into the Pentagon building. And then the United Airlines flight 93, a Boeing 757, which crashed southeast of Pittsburgh while en route from Newark, New Jersey to San Francisco with 38 passengers on board. Now, I'm joined here by David Learmont of Flight International and by Chris Hodgkinson, who's an airline pilot. One can only imagine the horror of what went on in those planes. A lot of speculation has been that the people who hijacked them actually took over the controls of the plane and flew them into these towers. Do you agree with that?
I would go along with the fact that they probably, the people who hijacked the aircraft may well have been those who aimed the aircraft at the buildings. But remember, we've never seen hijacks like this before, and the pilots will not have been ready for anything remotely like this. The hijackers may have acted to start with like ordinary hijackers and used the pilots to navigate them to, let's say, take me to New York. As you recall, one of the flights took off from Boston and ended up hitting the towers in New York. So they may well have pretended to be ordinary hijackers who wanted a destination. Then, when they got there, it would have been easy to have disposed of the pilots, you know, got them, either shot them, or whatever weaponry. We don't have any idea of what weaponry these people had to threaten the pilots with, so we don't know exactly what the pilots underwent. But air controls are sufficiently intuitive that even a relatively untrained person, if their only task was to aim at something and hit it, they could probably have done that.
Chris Hodgkinson, would the people controlling these flights, after all, we're talking about an area which probably has more flights in it than any other part of the world almost, except for the surrounds of Heathrow, would they have known what was going on, had any inkling of what was happening, or would these be planes that just disappeared from their control?
That, I'm sure, remains a matter of conjecture at this stage. What the air traffickers thought, I'm sure, will come out in the inquiry, but I have no indication at this stage as to what
are pilots trained to do in circumstances like this?
The training that a pilot is given is basically to use his common sense. It's extremely difficult to control security once people are on the aircraft. Someone made a comment to me earlier this evening. Aircraft security stops at the aircraft side, and I would suggest that for the vast majority of airliners in the world, that is the case. You then have to judge the situation, the captain has to judge the situation as he finds it, and act accordingly.
But are you critical of the security controls in the United States? Because you think that could have happened from Heathrow or from any European airport?
Security is very good generally around the world. There are one or two places which is not quite so good, but I would suggest to you that if a determined effort was made, it is practically impossible to stop it, sadly.
David Emmer, do you agree with that? That you could, that an armed gang of hijackers can get on any plane anywhere in the world?
It is absolutely staggering that 4 hijacks should be able to take place in America all at the same time, all coordinated. Now, there's a great anomaly with American security. In President Clinton's first term of office, he actually set up a commission under Vice President Gore to study the needs for aviation security in America. And this, the report suggested a major ramping up of aviation security throughout throughout America, domestic America, and internationally. Now, it was fully implemented for their international flights, but the airlines who operate domestically protested that it would slow the system down too much. So the government listened to them and did not ramp up security internally. And all these flights, it is not an accident that all these flights were domestic flights. That was America's weakest point, and the terrorists knew this.
And they just didn't take the threat seriously in the United States.
I'm not saying there's no security on domestic flights in the USA. That's not right. You will have your bag x-rayed, etc. But you've no idea the difference between domestic air travel in America and domestic air travel in this country or in Europe. It's much more a sausage machine over there. Everything is processed very much faster, very much more peremptorily. The aircraft are turned round very much faster. The whole thing is geared to speed. It's much more for an American who travels regularly domestically like getting on board a bus. It is an everyday occurrence.
So it would have been much harder to have done this kind of thing in Europe
it would have
than
been,
in the United
yes,
States, is your opinion?
It's not impossible to do this anywhere. I don't think it was an accident that they didn't try to do this with an American international flight, because security on American flights internationally is very good. And certainly security even for domestic flights in Europe is a lot better than it is on domestic flights in the USA, and this is now going to change forever.
David, thank you very much. Robert Hall is at Heathrow this evening. The impact of this on the aviation business, of course, and on airlines all over the world is huge. But what is the position tonight down at Heathrow, Robert?
Well, it's interesting that thousands of people, of course, using that Atlantic route, David, but at first a lot of them would have known that something was amiss, that something terrible was unfolding, was when they heard that tannoy announcement on their aircraft telling them that they were turning back, because every single transatlantic flight this afternoon that was on its way across and hadn't reached the point of no return, i.e. had enough fuel to get back, did just that, and those passengers are beginning to arrive back now. Just the start of what could be a long period of disruption.
Have you been talking to people in the airline industry about their reaction?
I think there's a feeling of disbelief throughout the airport, not only amongst the passengers, but amongst the professionals here. Thousands of people who knew it might happen, some of whom are trained to face it, but can't quite believe it has happened. I've been joined here by Kevin Crehan. Now, he is a member of the cabin crew for United. You also represent the union that looks after the cabin crew. You've just set up a crisis centre. You've come from there. When you walked into the airport this afternoon and faced the staff, how were people taking it in? How could they take it in?
Well, it's a shock. Actually, it goes beyond shock. It's a numbness. When this afternoon when I learned of it, I was down in Brighton. I took the train back, and when I arrived, it was different. Just the feeling as you walked into Terminal 3. It was just this stillness. The faces on the staff. You know, people are trained to deal with certain amount of emergency activities, so they know this is the type of risk that can result in disaster. But it was a shocking numbness that I found when I arrived at the airport today.
And presumably part of the crisis centre is to offer those people counselling if they need it, because I don't know, but nobody knows yet the composition of who was lost. Yeah. But presumably people here may have lost friends.
Yeah, the crisis center is set up to deal with all aspects of the airline in recovering, and the role of the Association of Flight Attendants is to deal with the emotional trauma of the staff. We're trained in critical incident response, and actually just this past month, very coincidentally, we had a very good joint training with the local management and local union reps on how do you deal with the aftermath, and it's really the emotional trauma that we'll be looking after.
There's one question. We talked about preparedness. We've just been hearing from our aviation expert in the studio about the lack of preparedness, in his view, on US internal flights. How would you react to that?
Well, I wouldn't call it a lack of preparedness. There's certainly a different level of security for an internal flight in the U.S. versus an international flight. And I think that's true here at Heathrow, where a flight that leaves Terminal 3 internationally has a very high level of security, and a flight that's leaving perhaps out of Terminal 1 may have a different level of security for a domestic flight. And it's quite the same in the U.S. The same analogy would apply.
Can you see this bringing about a review? I mean, as far as your members are concerned, can you see your members asking now for changes?
I'm sure that this is going to cause people to worry about the security procedures in effect. I'm definitely sure that they will be asking for changes. This is the type of thing, though, when we have an incident like this, the union, management, the security professionals within the FAA, the CAA, everybody gets together to review what has happened and how to respond. And, you know, what was it, if there was anything that was avoidable?
Thank you very much for those. Just one closing point from here, David. I think although there's a heightened level of security, a greater sense of alert here, it's fair to say that passengers are philosophical about it. After all, what disruption they're suffering is as nothing compared to the tragedy that's unfolding across the Atlantic.
Thank you very much, Robert. It's 4 o'clock in New York, and we go back there to see the latest scenes of how this southern half of the city still completely shrouded in smoke. You'll have seen those pictures we showed earlier on of the whole place erupting with smoke and dust. Well, there is the World Trade Center as it is this afternoon in New York, abandoned. It's like the scenes from bombing in the Second World War, even perhaps of Hiroshima. They're not on that scale, but it is the most devastating. I said at the beginning, this is 21st century war. What we don't yet know is who's behind it all. Two extremist Palestinian groups already denied that it was them. American intelligence has said their suspicions have already fallen upon one man, the Saudi dissident Osama bin Laden, who's been public enemy #1 in the States since the revelation that he was behind the World Trade Center bombing 8 years ago. Now, Panorama's reporter Jane Corbin has actually been on bin Laden's trail for the last few years.
He's the world's most wanted man with a $3 million price on his head, accused of masterminding a series of terror attacks. Osama bin Laden, a man born into a wealthy Saudi family who rejected...
Next call is Chico, California. Good afternoon.
Hi, my name's Glenda Lee Hoffman. I'm calling from Chico. I just wanted to say that last night I was watching Joseph Biden, the senator, talk to the World Press Corps, and he was talking about this exact thing, saying that it isn't that we needed to spend money on an anti-ballistic missile system. We needed to spend money beefing up security for possible terrorist attacks. So Joe Biden was right on about that. And the second thing I want to point out is that it's our commercial airlines that are lacking in the security. It's not our military forces. It's the commercial airlines. They're the ones that brought in all the terrorists somehow. And somehow these terrorists, they planned all this. In other words, they actually got on airlines and acted as if they were going to hijack them to make sure they could. So, you know, this was so well planned, and they knew that they could carry it off.
Thanks, caller. Thanks very much. More from the Washington Post website on some of the details from earlier today as Air Force One took off from the Air Force Base in Louisiana at about 1:30 this afternoon for a destination unknown. This is a quote from the Washington Post article. The Boeing 747 taxied down the runway at Barksdale near Shreveport, but the small pool of reporters on board were ordered off their cell phones, and contrary to normal practice, no journalists were allowed on the base to watch the plane lift off. The president had landed here in Barksdale, Arizona about 90 minutes earlier under escort by a military fighter jet arriving from Florida, where he had intended to make an education speech. At first, the reports of the attacks on the New York World Trade Center, Bush had told students at Sarasota Elementary School that he was heading back to Washington, and all of that immediately changed, and he was diverted to Louisiana when a plane slammed into the Pentagon and Washington, too, was under attack. Secret Service agents took the extraordinary step of sweeping White House aides for explosives and weapons before they were allowed to board the president's plane for his flight out of Sarasota. And you may know that the First Lady was scheduled to testify on Capitol Hill today on education issues.